CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
Hey, what's going on, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of CFL 110 here on the Winnipeg Sports Talk YouTube and podcast channel. I'm Andrew Paterson along with Jeff Hamilton of the Winnipeg Free Press, taking you around the CFL with the latest stories coming out of Week 5, heading into Week 6. Going to be a good one. Some big games coming up on the schedule for Week number 6, and lots to chew on coming out of Week 5. As we get right into it. CFL 110, as always, brought to you by our great sponsors at Garage Living Winnipeg. And those of you in and around the Winnipeg area, quite familiar with our pal Pat Kanuga, longtime member of the CBC Morning Show, who's now moved on to more of a labor of love as a vintage car guy, transforming garages for Winnipeggers and Manitobans into a spot that'll not only boost the value of their home, but a spot where they love to spend a heck of a lot more time. You know, Pat's been getting calls from people on Winnipeg Sports Talk through the summer, and they're now booking jobs into September already. So if you want an extreme garage makeover or a minor garage makeover before winter, give Pat a call at 999-204-999-1234. Garage Living Winnipeg can help clear the clutter so you have a clean, organized, gorgeous space to hang out. Maybe you have the boys over for the big game, and that can happen in just a few days. Your garage will be completely revamped, specializing in durable polyaspartic floor coatings, premium made-in-Canada metal cabinets, slat wall and overhead storage solutions for a functional garage that looks amazing and adds value to your home. Again, give Pat a call for a free in-garage consultation and get some ideas on how it can be transformed. 204-999-1234, whether it's a single, double, triple, or a 10-car garage mahal, Pat can come up with a design to meet your needs within your budget. Garage Living Winnipeg, sponsors of CFL 110, garages made for living. All right, let's get the hammer in here and get going. What's going on, dude? How are you?
Haas, I think like most people, I'm just trying to survive the heat. I have the luxury of air conditioning, but I just can't seem to regulate my body temperature. It's wild. I took 3 showers yesterday, and none of them were warm. So it's been a bit of a trial, but small problem on all things considered. How are you doing, man?
I'm doing great, and I'm loving the heat. We haven't had a great summer so far. There's been a lot of rain, so I am here for it right now. And I got to tell you, I am here for 32 degrees and sunny at Princess Auto Stadium for this Bomber Stamps rematch on Friday night as a part of what shaping up to be a great slate of games for Week 6 in the Canadian Football League. We'll look at the lines a little later on for Coolbet, but let's get right to the top stories coming out of Week 5. And before we get to everything happening on the field, one of the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League from the last number of weeks has been the status of Shawn Lemon, who was retired. Then he was suspended. Then he was appealing. Then he was playing. Now he's not playing anymore again. Fill us in on the independent arbitrator and what's the latest on the Shawn Lemon situation with the undefeated Montreal Alouettes.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it's been a little bit of a circus in this whole situation, right? It was first started with Shawn Lemon retiring surprisingly, right? Because he had just won a Grey Cup with Montreal and had just signed a year extension to be with them for this season. So his retirement was wild. And then, of course, the news came out from the CFL that Shawn Lemon was busted essentially betting on games. From what we understand, it was a one-ticket, $70 euros, which is about equivalent to $100 Canadian on 2 games, including one of his own, back in 2021 as a member of the Calgary Stampeders. Now, at that point, the two sides had met and talked about it. I think Shawn Lemon was under the understanding that the league wouldn't say anything or wouldn't go public with the news. And so he felt his retirement would ultimately allow him to kind of just go off into the sunset being a Grey Cup, multi-time Grey Cup champion, and not have to deal with any of the, media craziness and just craziness in general, being accused of gambling on your own games. And so that obviously didn't work out in his favor. And so I think, and when the league made the announcement, man, I mean, there was 2 statements attached to it. It wasn't just the league talking about it. The Montreal Alouettes made a comment. They said they were disappointed with his actions, and said that I don't know if they actually said they were disappointed in his actions. That was Calgary's statement. Of course, he was a member of the Calgary Stampeders, as I mentioned, in 2021, but the Alouettes said that they fully supported the league's rules. Well, I think Shawn Lemon got pretty pissed off at the fact that he had to deal with all this stuff and decided to throw it back in their faces. And if anyone that knows the CFL appeal process, it doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen, in a week. It can sometimes take weeks, if not months. And in this case, certainly did that. I mean, he appealed in May, was able to go through camp, able to play through the first 4 games until he wasn't. Of course, the arbitrator now standing up and saying that the league is justified in their suspension, and they'll have a hearing on it August 1st and 2nd. Lemon's camp, of course, wanted to extend it by a month, and I think that's where the league stepped in. The independent arbitrator said they were justified in suspending him immediately, and here we are. Now, I think it's whether or not it gets messy, I think both sides are extremely motivated. Look, the league has been in front of a number of scandals, if you will, over the last X amount of years here. They've had egg on their face before, but never have they used, at least in my recollection, as strong a language against a player as they did with Shawn Lemon. I mean, they said irrefutable proof against him that he was gambling on games. And my conversations with, when I say games, I mean 2 games and 1 ticket. That's essentially what he's been busted for. And in talking to my sources, I think it's a pretty interesting situation, because that irrefutable proof that the CFL has is ultimately the same signature on whatever gambling site that he signed up for, matching the signature on his contract. So he doesn't really, he can't really hide from the fact that he's gambling. I think where he's coming from is that he didn't gamble a lot, or that it didn't have any effects on the game with the games, which the league has backed up. Now, personally, I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Any player would even imagine doing these, betting on games, let alone their own. And I know it's an added layer if you were to bet against your team. In this case, Shawn Lemon bet for his team, but still, I mean, it's the one rule that that all pro athletes know, that it's like the one cardinal sin. And I don't say this lightly, but you can do a lot more shit in your life, really, really dangerous stuff, violent stuff to people, and still have a chance to play football. You can break the law in many, many different ways and still be able to get a second chance in this game. Professional sports, when it comes to integrity, that's what they have. It's the foundation of their leagues, and betting is just a cardinal sin. So I think, Shawn Lemon's going to go into this arbitration, if you will, debate, saying that he didn't know the rules, that it wasn't until 2023 that the league, or whatever it was, that the league really sat down everybody and explained to them, even though the league has had rules in place, including in 2021. So I don't know how long this is going to last, but I know it's probably going to get messy before it gets any cleaner.
It has been a bizarre, story to follow. And I mean, listen, I'm with you. I mean, these players, there's no excuse for claiming to not know the rules around wagering on Canadian Football League games when you're playing in the Canadian Football League. I mean, and there's no gray area about it either. No. I mean, I get it. You're talking about one bet and he picked his team to win. Does that really matter? In the small scale, no. But in the big picture, when guys do get in, especially if you get to that point where you're betting on games, what happens if you get on a bad run? I mean, there's so much that can threaten the integrity of the game, and that's why it is simply a non-starter when it comes to any player. And it doesn't matter if you're Zach Collaros or an MOP candidate or some guy that's just sniffing around on the practice roster. The rules are there, they're black and white, and there really is absolutely no wiggle room for this. So based on all of this, Jeff, I don't know that Shawn Lemon has much to debate or dispute, but he can't play anymore. He's going on forward. What is the time frame for clarity on this and a final decision to put this to bed one way or the other?
The only thing we really know as far as dates, Huss, is that August 1st, 2nd. That's essentially when this was, going to be pushed to and chatted about. And I know the league is going to be fierce in their case. I mean, this is unprecedented in the league. It's not unprecedented in other leagues, and other leagues when you're caught gambling, whether it's your games or otherwise, it comes with stiff penalties. And you look at Shawn Lemon, now in his mid-30s, how much more football does he have left? How much more football will he be able to play? I think that's the big question here. One of the other things, too, is I think one of the concerns with the league and why I think this all came to a head, because a lot of people wonder, well, what did the league do? Do they send in a bunch of names or how do they have this filtering process with betting? Well, I'll tell you what, the CFL does not have the money to back check on every single player in the league and what their gambling activity is. But from what I gathered from what I understand, what I've been told was that Shawn Lemon was dabbling and gambling on CFL games when he wasn't a member of a CFL team. And that is legal. That's allowed. But if you're doing that at the same time that you're trying to get on a roster, that's going to draw some red flags. And that's what I gathered is why they actually investigated Shawn Lemon in the first place. Now, Shawn Lemon's in a fight for his career, essentially, here. I mean, this is a guy who, registered his 100th sack last season. He's a multi-Grey Cup winner. He is a recognizable face in the Canadian Football League. And, the verdict of this could very well decide his fate in any kind of conversations, whether it's, Canadian Football Hall of Fame or whatnot. So, not to mention just his straight up reputation. I think both sides have a lot to lose in this case, and both will be certainly motivated to win, obviously for different reasons. But, I'm very, very interested in the verdict, even if I have no idea when it's going to actually come down.
Yeah, it is somewhat topical, too, because today, south of the border in New York City, former Raptor Jonte Porter pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud in a federal criminal case tied to the betting scandal that got him banned from the NBA earlier this year. And I mean, it's the sign of the times. I mean, there has been a number of issues in the National Football League, NBA, of course. So it shouldn't be a surprise, but these leagues have to be incredibly vigilant with this. And, from an Alouettes perspective, they lose Shawn Lemon, who can be a real difference maker. But, man, they haven't missed a beat at all. Big comeback win against the Calgary Stampeders, doing teams like the Bombers a favor in the West right now. And to me, I mean, with BC having lost a game right now, Saskatchewan banged up without Trevor Harris, a clear number one team in the league is the Montreal Alouettes, despite not having Shawn Lemon for the foreseeable future.
The question's already being asked when the Alouettes are going to wrap up the East. Look at who they were facing. At the beginning, it looked like Toronto without Chad Kelly was going to threaten perhaps that potential first place, but it doesn't seem like a threat anymore. And if you look at the Hamilton Tiger Cats, they're just getting seemingly worse each week. And of course, the Ottawa Red Blacks, not a great team, not a bad team per se, certainly making strides, but not a great team whatsoever. And so it looks like when you see what's happening in Toronto, you see what's happening in the rest of the division, it only feels like a matter of time before the Alouettes do wrap this up, assuming they can continue their dominance here. I will say this, though, it didn't come easy last week, and whether or not that was a byproduct of Shawn Lemon not in the lineup or not, but it wasn't as easy sledding for the Montreal Alouettes last week as it has been in previous weeks.
No, but it was a clutch fourth quarter. I mean, and Cody Fajardo has played just phenomenally. It's almost like he is a different guy from the 3-minute warning of last year's Grey Cup to a guy that, to many is leading the MOP discussion along with Vernon Adams so far this year. It's been a great start.
Amazing what getting out of Regina and moving to Montreal can do for someoun's life, eh? Holy smokes.
Well, hey, listen, speaking of Regina, as we move on to the Riders, the Alouettes aren't the only undefeated team in the league. The Riders are 4-0 despite losing Trevor Harris. They've got a massive game, which we'll get to in a minute, coming into BC. But I think the big question around the Canadian Football League is what's going on with the crowds in Regina? This had been a team that had been for a long time the standard when it came to support. They've had a few really rough years, Jeff, and it has eroded the fan base. There are other factors as well, but how loud are the concerns or the alarms, if you will, coming out of Regina about a couple of the early season crowds that they've had, despite the great vibe around the team and the undefeated record?
I think you can look at it two different ways. I think you can look at it as, concerning. Absolutely. I mean, 25, they didn't eclipse 25,000 in the home opener, which is the lowest home opener in Mosaic Stadium. They were, as you mentioned, it was under 24,000 last week. So that's the lowest number ever at Mosaic Stadium. You can look at what happened the two previous years and losing the last 7 games to wrap up the season and the Craig Dickinson era, if you will. Maybe there's a bit of stink left from that. And of course the box office. I mean, this is supposed to be Canada's team, right? And I know there's going to be people in Winnipeg cringing, but that's the reality. I mean, this is the number one ticket in town in Saskatchewan. They get support, throughout the province, worldwide even. How wild is it to see a world championship hockey game out in the Czech Republic? And if you scan the fans long enough, you're going to see some guy in a Riders hat.
There's always a guy in a Riders shirt. I mean,
totally,
Wimbledon.
Exactly. So, there's really, I mean, Winnipeg is king right now when it comes to attendance, and rightfully so. I mean, Winnipeg's fan base is incredible, but so is Saskatchewan. So that's the other side. There's 2 games, and so far it's been Sunday and Thursday, and those days are not ideal for that market. I mean, I forget what the percentage it is, but it's a big chunk of people who are season ticket holders and who attend those games that travel from outside of the city.
Long drives.
So long drives, long drives, hours and hours in cases. And so Sunday doesn't really work and Thursday doesn't really work. So maybe we need to hold up a little bit here in the sense that, wait and realize how many fans might come to a Saturday afternoon game or a Friday night game. One that's a little bit more, reachable for those out of town fans. But still, even when you consider that, I mean, it's embarrassing. Like, I mean, it is what it is. I mean, this is supposed to be a fan base that, is supposed to be raw Riders. And you look at the team under Corey Mace this year, and credit to Corey Mace, after a big 4-0 win, is pleading to the fans to come, to show up, to pack the house. This is a good team. Now, Corey Mace has done magic over the last few months to fix the team's culture, to, get them playing better. I mean, I don't think anybody really had Shea Paterson leading them to victory. And while, he didn't throw the lights out, he did play pretty well, but that defense and special teams is carrying the load. And that's signs of a really good team when you can get through some of those obstacles. So you can't look at the record. You can't look at, all these things on the field that are the issue. What are the issues off the field that's not having these fans? And I talked to a few fans, Huss. I made a comment I mentioned Canada's team and, what gives kind of thing. And there's still a lot of fans out there that feel hurt from previous years, don't love the lack of selection at concessions or the price of concessions. They say they're too high. The tickets have always been the highest in the league to go to Riders. Some fans were complaining about the ticket prices, but all those things have existed for quite some time. It's still quite shocking that 23,000 fans are showing up to at that point a 3-0 Riders club.
Yeah, listen, I won't be, and I'm going to cut the fans a bit of a break here.
Yeah, of course.
In that, listen, the team has stunk. They've had a couple miserable years, and that fan base, I think, kind of felt taken advantage of. And listen, there are real world issues right now in our community here in the Peg, on the prairies, and really from coast to coast when it comes to just how much the average guy and female, I mean, the average family is getting squeezed right now, whether it comes to their grocery bill, interest rates, all of these things. And I mean, that cannot be ignored. Now, winning can change everything. I mean, it can change your priorities, but listen, we knew that they were bleeding season tickets for the last few years, and a lot of that was focused on the on-field product, which is legitimate and is a big part of it, but there's also a bunch of other things. And more so in any other market in the league, those Thursday and Sunday nights really hurt the Riders. And you mentioned, I'm not sure if people outside of the market or the prairies understand the commitment that so many Rider fans make to get to those games. 3-hour drives, 4-hour drives, 5-hour drives, one way to come back. Hotel rooms often. I mean, there's a lot that goes in. And when you're talking about Thursday or Sunday games, often that means taking a day off work. So they knew that they were up against it this year. And I think, like, we've seen with Winnipeg in the National Hockey League and other places, I mean, there are real world challenges that have not been there in the past that are there, that are definitely impacting not the people's love of their teams, but their ability to support them the way they have in the past. The one thing that this team can do, I mean, they needed to, and I think they realized they needed to do a better job of appreciating their fan base, rewarding their season ticket holders. And from what I understand, they've made some strides there. And now they're making the strides on the field under Corey Mace right now. And this is going to be something that I think will be followed. And in other markets, they would kill to have the support that Saskatchewan has. But to your point, they, for a long time, up until recently, with the rise of the Bombers over this last number of years, have been the standard in the Canadian Football League. Edmonton was very similar at the same time. And, we've seen what happened in those markets too. So somewhat a sign of the times, also has to do with the on-field product. But I will say this is going to improve, I think, as we get into the summer with some better game dates, some of the bigger games, another trip from the Bombers there actually next week. And on top of it all, winning will help. They hadn't done enough of that over the last number of years. And the start of the Corey Mace era has been an absolute home run on the field right now at 4-0.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that it comes on the heels of a $1.1 million loss for Saskatchewan. So the front office is listening loud and clear to the fans that are clearly voting with their feet, if you will, not showing up. So hopefully we see some better days over for a crazy market, because certainly there's plenty to attract you on the field worth going. So we'll see what happens.
Well, and one other thing, this is, and I think they had to know that going to the new schedule, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, one game a day, was going to give some teams some less than optimal nights for bringing fans into the building. But the thought was the benefit on the television side, which is so important right now, would top that. And this sort of goes with it. The Riders are on the road this week. And this is clearly the game of the week when you look at the records. The 4-0 Riders going to BC to take on the 4-0 or 4-1 Lions, I should say. And the Lions have arguably been the hottest team in the Canadian Football League, certainly the hottest offense since that hiccup and blowing that 14-point lead in Toronto to begin the season. It is too bad, Jeff, that we're not going to get the best of the Riders with Trevor Harris in. But that defense made a big statement last week against Cameron Dukes, who I think is still smarting from a 4-pick game. Really looking forward to this one, but I can't say that I'm surprised that BC's a heavy favorite, considering the way they've been playing moving into this game. An absolute humiliation of the Tiger Cats last weekend in the Sunday night game. And now opening up the upper deck, speaking of fans and positive ticket news in BC, I can't wait for this one, but more than a touchdown favorite on the Coolbet lines for the BC Lions. But I get it. I don't think anyone wants to get in the way of that Lions offense, but the Saskatchewan defense has been maybe as good defensively as the BC offense has been. So it really sets up a heck of a premier matchup tonight, this weekend in the league on Saturday.
Yeah, as I mentioned, I think they're left wanting a bit on offense, obviously, with Trevor Harris being out, but love what they're doing on defense. Absolutely confusing a Ryan Dinwiddie-led offense. Cameron Dukes had been playing pretty well through the first couple of weeks, kind of had a bit of a drop-off his third game, but they absolutely exploited him. That's probably enough gushing about the Riders for me right now, though, because I think this is the week that they get a little bit of a wake-up call here. I think they're going into a BC place that is going to be ready to start early and often. I mean, you look at the Riders' schedule, and it hasn't really been that challenging. We don't really know what the Edmonton Elks are besides an 0-4 team right now. We know how close they've come to winning almost all their games, but unfortunately fallen on the opposite side of that for their fan base. They played Hamilton twice. We know how bad Hamilton is. BC Lions just absolutely embarrassed them. I think the final score was flattering, and they still lost by 17 points or so. So I think this is the week that the Lions kind of rattle the Riders a little bit here, and I'm more than happy to eat my words, because if I'll flip that. I'll say the Riders have a real opportunity here to make a statement in this league by beating the Lions at home. It's one of the most challenging places to play. There is no great equalizer when it comes to weather, so it's not like you can play a incredibly rainy game there, and you can take advantage of that defensively. This is BC Place, so I just think this is the week for the Lions. Vernon Adams has not slowed down. He just seems to get better every week. He's my front runner for sure for MOP. Very very early MOP voting. I just think everything's clicking there. You look the way he's had, the chemistry he's had with Justin McInnes, who just seems to get open every time he runs down the field. That's not to forget a guy like Alexander Hollins, who could very well be the best receiver in this league. So you bring in a guy like William Stanback, who hasn't been lights out, but he does bring in a running threat for you. And I think that this is kind of feeling like BC's year a little bit. And so it's a big challenge for the Riders. I'm not going to say it's not a challenge for the BC Lions either, because it's not like they haven't had close calls, right? I mean, Edmonton went into their house on a very short week and lost in a walk-off in some mistake football at the end. So it's not like they're not beatable. But I do think the Lions do come out in what will be a really, really great matchup, and the winner leaving with top spot in the West.
Yeah, well, we're going to find out about this Rider defense going up against their biggest challenge of the year, and we'll see whether the Lions can keep on rolling like they've been recently against a defense that has been at the top of the league so far. That is the Saturday game. Friday, Bombers hosting the Stamps, and Zach is back. Zach Collaros back in after the Bombers got off the schneid.
Nice
dominating the
credit to Remo on the picture.
That's beautiful. Dominating the line of scrimmage and running the football down the throat of the Ottawa Red Blacks. A great turnaround for the Bombers, who had lost a bunch of close games. They move on. They get their quarterback back right now. And Jeff, I mean, it certainly gives Buck Pierce more options when it comes to setting up the offense. And I think we saw that the passing offense with Strevler is limited. But I got to tell you, I mean, just from a defensive perspective, the team played very well. But most importantly, that offensive line really stepped up. And they're going to need to do that to get Zach to being back to 2023 and 2022 Zach Collaros, and not the guy that struggled through the first 4 games of the season. And I don't need to remind you the importance of this game. With Calgary beating Winnipeg earlier in the season in Calgary, a win in Winnipeg would give them the season series and the tiebreaker already ahead of the Bombers. So particularly for the home team, Winnipeg, the hole that they dug themselves in with those 4 losses to begin the season, they got to have this one Friday night at Princess Auto Stadium.
Yeah, as you mentioned, it doesn't get any easier, man. It goes Calgary, then Saskatchewan, Toronto, and then back-to-back against BC. So Winnipeg can't be taking this lightly to get out of their hole, and they're not taking it lightly. So I'm not even sure why I'm even suggesting as much. But, this is, it's great news that Zach Collaros is back. I think, a decision was made last week, fairly early into the week, not to play him. I think it was, rooted strictly from a precautionary situation, because when he came out on practice on Monday, he didn't look any worse for wear. I mean, he was rolling out of the pocket. Usually with injuries, when guys miss games, they get eased into practice. They're not trying as much perhaps early on, and that certainly wasn't the case for Zach Collaros. So it's good news for him, as you mentioned. Looking to get back to form. He still hasn't thrown a passing touchdown since week 20 of last year. That's not what we're used to seeing from number 8 in Winnipeg here, but so it hasn't necessarily been easy. I know there's some fans out there that certainly loved what Chris Strevler brought to the table last week. I don't know how you couldn't. I mean, this guy's the ultimate teammate, the ultimate warrior when it comes to to putting his body on the line each and every play. I mean, that how sustainable he would be able to play the game he played last week over an 18-game season. Don't think it's possible, but I really do hope that Chris Strevler showed Buck Pearson that he deserves a spot on this offense, that he brings his skill set is unique, whether it's throwing the ball, which I know still probably needs a little bit of work, but certainly running the ball, bringing in packages, but just the energy that he brings to the lineup, the energy he brings to the huddle, the mood he brings. Guys want to play for him. Guys certainly want to play for Zach. That's not what I'm making the argument about. But if you look at Chris Strevler's usage before he was thrust into action midway through that game in Calgary, it was fairly light. It was pretty much what you would expect if Dakota Prukop was still on this team, right? Some trick, not even that tricky plays, but just the short yardage stuff that he does so well. I hope this opens up the playbook for him. I hope they can get him involved in the run game, because it certainly looked to me that the Red Blacks had no idea who was going to punish them between Chris Streveler and Brady Oliveira. And on that one drive, 11 plays, 11 runs. The Bombers didn't even hide the fact that they were going to shove it down their throat. So that's the kind of bully ball that I think a lot of Bomber fans have been used to over the years, and certainly has existed with Zach Collaros behind center. It's getting that back on track. And I think a big thing for Zach is going to be the play of Brady Oliveira. Brady Oliveira had his breakout game last week. I hope Buck Pierce was watching. He certainly was. He was going over the tape. Get this guy some touches. He needs to get some touches to get going. And I think if you can open up that run game, much like they did against Ottawa, I think it's going to open up a lot more options for Zach Collaros. And Zach has a much more accurate arm, compared to Chris Streveler. So if his O-line, who also took a step forward in the right direction, if they can continue to play the way they played last week, I think we will see the old Zach Collaros come back and I think that this is an opportunity for the Bombers to go 2-0 against a beatable Calgary Stampeders.
Well, yeah, and then set up a trip to Regina at 2-4, which sounds a heck of a lot better than 1-5. And just to echo your comments, I mean, the fact that they know that they can run the football that way, they are stepping up. Probably, I would say, somewhat going up against Calgary's line and linebacking core, but that will be something that I think we will see. And we'll probably see a few Streveler-led drives focusing on the run game, mixing it up between Zach Collaros. And the more the run game can get going and the offensive line can get back in their groove, the better that will be for Zach Collaros. One other thing that came out of the Winnipeg-Ottawa game last week was an unfortunate hit that knocked quarterback Dru Brown out of the game. There was somewhat of a retaliatory hit afterwards on Chris Streveler, who stayed in the game. Good news for Ottawa. Dru Brown was back in practice. I believe he's still technically in concussion protocol, but that bodes well for his availability moving forward for the game on Sunday against Edmonton. There was a lot of talk about that hit, at least the first one hit of Cramdy on Dru Brown. And, from where I sit, Jeff, that was a really unfortunate play. I don't think it was malicious. But with the speed of the game and the strength of these athletes, it is pro football. That will happen. I certainly think it should have been flagged, but I didn't think it should have gone past there. And I think the majority of people would agree on that. How did you see the hit and the way it was handled by both the officials and the league afterwards?
Yeah, I got lots of thoughts on this, actually. I was saying in the press box wrongfully that I thought that the Cramdy hit was worse than Tobias Harris on Chris Streveler. That was just from what I'd seen from my press box view. When I went through the hits, I changed my mind. I really do think, you think somewhat. I think it was absolutely retaliatory by Tobias Harris on Chris Streveler. I think he realized where he was on the field, that at most he would get half the distance to the end zone. So it was 7 yards, I think it was at that point. You look at the first play, and this is where I have an issue with it, because I really appreciated Red Hot Cramdy's comments after the game. I mean, he apologized. He acknowledged, that it wasn't a good play. He acknowledged that fans were likely going to call him a dirty player, that he doesn't like to see players get injured. And those are the things you certainly want to hear from a player after the game when they have the situation. So there was a lot of accountability from there. I mean, he mentions the fast style of game and all that. And we've seen this in the past, right? I mean, it wasn't as bad as other kind of similar situations we've seen, but it still wasn't good. And so the thing that, sticks out for me with the Cramdy stuff is, I'll bring it back to, I think it was last season. Remember that game against the BC Lions in BC that Winnipeg won a thriller in overtime because the BC Lions just, for some reason, thought they were going for pay dirt and then end up getting tackled with no time allowed, had the receiver, I forget who it was. It's forgetting me. But what it had
game of the year last year that ultimately put the Bombers in, pretty good position for first place in the West. And there was a lot of talk after that game about how, and again, I can't believe I forget the receiver, but caught the ball, and it was Red Hot Cramdy who dove at the guy, and everyone was making this comment about how could he miss the guy and blah, blah. And then you had Mike O'Shea and others saying, no, that was by design. That he made this decision split second not
to hit his foot because he saw his teammate in front of him and the clock he knew was winding down. So we have proof right there. And I mean, people might call me a mad scientist or have my tinfoil hat. I'm not making an argument against Red Hawk Cramdy, but if we're going to give him credit for making a decision, split-second decision, because that's what it was, he did leap and he reached, and we're going to give him credit for that, we should also be saying that he should have better, decision-making skills in that situation. Now, do you want to make the argument that Dru Brown slid early? Yeah, maybe. I don't really buy that, to be honest with you. I think, this is a guy who's not going to truck you. And as soon as you see him, I mean, you got to finish the play. So it's not like you can just assume he's going to slide per se, but I don't think the slide was all that late. Here's my biggest issue. I think sliding is ridiculous. I honestly think that, whether it should be allowed in the game or not, if you're a quarterback and you want to take the ball beyond the line of scrimmage, you're no longer a quarterback anymore. You should be fair game to get hit. This, protecting quarterbacks who can slide and all that stuff. Dustin Crum, I thought, put it, this is the backup quarterback who ultimately took over for Dru Brown after the injury. He said after the game, he didn't think it was a dirty play, the Red Hawk Cramdy hit. And then went into saying, obviously was looking out for Dru. It wasn't like he was like, that wasn't a dirty play. He certainly had Dru Brown, top of mind and his health. But then he went into talking about how sliding puts you in such a vulnerable situation. Once you slide, you're ultimately at, the luck of whether or not this guy's going to come through you. You're so vulnerable to that play. And so I just don't love sliding in general. And I think I think this needs to be reassessed, that if a quarterback wants to play like something other than a guy throwing from behind the line of scrimmage, he should be susceptible to taking hits, not headshots, but hits.
Don't hold your breath on that, because the importance of the quarterbacks in the Canadian Football League and the NFL for that matter continues to be paramount to any success. These are the most highly paid athletes in the game. Listen, the rules are there to protect them as much as possible, and they will always err towards doing exactly that right now. I'm with you. I mean, listen, in the National
There are
Football
lots
League
of rules,
times,
though, Huss. There are lots of rules that protect quarterbacks. All the rules protect quarterbacks. Not only do all the rules protect quarterbacks, they benefit quarterbacks.
Yeah, exactly, and that's not going to change anytime soon.
Benefit offense. So, I'm just talking about this one instance. I'm not looking to hurt quarterbacks. I know exactly what you're referring to, and it was in 2019 that this league took a real nosedive when a bunch of quarterbacks were injured. Now, they weren't injured off a bunch of, cheap shots. There were some unfortunate situations, some torn knees, stuff like that. But this league is not fun when you don't know the name behind center. So I agree with you on that one for sure.
Yeah, well, but it has been an issue. And I mean, I think back, and this is an NFL play, but I mean, Justin Herbert, and like these quarterbacks know what the rules are right now, and especially the really mobile quarterbacks who are getting out in open space. There's been a couple instances where they've sort of faked a slide and the defensive players have to back off because they're afraid of getting a fine and a 15-yarder, and the guy jukes him and goes for another 20 yards, and that's rubbed people the wrong way. And listen, that is going to be getting like unsportsmanlike conduct flags in the future, because you don't want to. I mean, the defenses are already up against it enough with the rules are it is. I mean, manipulating against the spirit of the rules is something that I think will be a watch out. Well, speaking of quarterbacks, the Argos are going about it without QB1 and last year's CFL MOP Chad Kelly. And it's funny how we heard a lot more about Chad Kelly after last week's game in Saskatchewan that we had in the first 2 weeks when things were going well for Toronto. Bit of a rude awakening or a dose of reality for Cameron Dukes, throwing 4 picks against Saskatchewan. And after a really nice start, back-to-back losses, including a double-digit loss at home to the Montreal Alouettes. And it seems like the Argos certainly in a bit of a tier below Montreal with the incredible start they've had so far in the East.
To me, it's a classic case of getting tape on a quarterback. Cameron Dukes came in, fared pretty well last season in his spot duty, including a narrow loss to the Winnipeg Blue Bombers in that game that everybody was up in arms about because, Toronto had wrapped up the East and they were playing for nothing for the last third of the season, essentially. So, I think, when you look at quarterbacks as they get more tape, as they play more games, as they play more defenses, they expose more weaknesses. And I think that was a classic case. I mean, helps that Corey Mace knows who Cameron Dukes is as the defensive coordinator for the Toronto Argonauts last season, went up against him in practice on several, every day essentially. And so that was an interesting wrinkle to it too. I think there's going to be a lot of teams out there that are going to be looking at the tape that Toronto played against Saskatchewan and trying to replicate that, because Cameron Dukes looked, disheveled. He did not look as comfortable as we've seen him at all here. And it was interesting to me actually afterwards, Haas. What did you think about Ryan Dinwiddie, committing to Chad Kelly as the club's starting quarterback while they're going through all this, this entire process essentially to get him back?
Well, I just found it a little weird. I mean, I guess it was just reinforcing the fact that, hey, I know this is a little blip. We still have our guy. But as I've said to you many times, I will believe it when I see it. If the CFL is going to stick to the guidelines of everything they set out for this guy to do, I am dubious that he has all of those clubs in his bag to do the counseling, to make the amends, to do everything it's going to take for him to get reinstated. Now, he's an important player for an important franchise. I mean, it is pro sports. So am I saying that he's not going to come back? No. But just knowing the knucklehead that Kelly's been throughout his entire life and knowing what Randy Ambrosie mandated that he has to do before he comes in, I still think there's a ways to go for that. And if I'm Dinwiddie, I'm not talking about Chad Kelly right now. I'm focusing on Dukes, the guys they have in that room on the practice field and in helmets on game day to go forward and get in. And they've got a big matchup coming up, which we'll get to in a second with the weekly games, a rematch against the Montreal Alouettes, this time in Montreal as a significant underdog. We didn't see the Elks last week. The two winless teams were the Bombers and Ticats. The Bombers are no longer in that club. And now the team that the Bombers beat, the Ottawa Red Blacks, well, they're going up against Edmonton. Edmonton has been so close. I'm higher on them than you. This has to be the week, though, right? I mean, 0-5, considering what's happened under Chris Jones the last few years, might be a death knell for this season and for this team moving forward, at least for 2024.
It's funny. I don't know if I'm low on them. Perhaps I'm lower than you, Huss. I was definitely harder on them in previous weeks. They are a decent team in the sense that they've been putting an effort out. It's
they
not
cover
like
every week. I love them.
Yeah, exactly. Your bank account loves them, I think, more than you actually love them. I think I'm just more critical at the fact that it's been two miserable seasons, and we're led to believe that Chris Jones is some kind of winning coach. So to start out the way it is, I mean, I get it's tough to win in this league. I get it's tough to win on the road. But when you've lost as much as you have through the first 2 years of your tenure and you start like this, I don't think you get that long of a leash. I think the Winnipeg Blue Bombers have been to the Grey Cup 4 years in a row, and they're getting their fair share of shade, from myself and others here in their start. So why the Elks would get some kind of break, I'm not 100% sure. Now, to your point, Huss, I think this is the absolute opportunity for them. I think that they go out there. I checked the odds. I believe they're 4-point favorites right now. I think they go out and they roll over Ottawa. I think this is a frustrated team. You look at the recent pickups for them. They've added, they boosted their defense with two veterans and Sean Oakman on the D-line. Derek Moncrief, who's been part of the organization in the past, he comes in. He's a solid player. Those should be difference makers for them, to a certain degree. We'll see how much they have left in the tank. But I do think that Edmonton, especially coming in off the bye week, because if there is one thing that they've had against them so far this season, it's been scheduling, not just, difficult opponents already this year, but they've received the short end of the stick, on a couple different occasions with their travel schedule and their days of, their days in between games. I believe they're at 17 days now here with the break, or whatever it is. It's certainly a lot. So there's no excuse as far as wear and tear for this team. Ottawa, as you mentioned, Dru Brown's back at practice, still in the concussion protocol, but even with him behind center, I don't think that they're incredibly scary. I do think this is finally the week that the Edmonton Elks get that victory and get back, dare I say, into the conversation of the West playoffs, because as we know, that 1-4 still puts you very much in the conversation versus an 0-5 start.
Well, and the funny thing is the Elks will be pulling for the Bombers to tighten things up with Calgary in third.
Sure.
And then, the Elks will get a couple cracks against the Bombers a little bit later on this season. That game is the finale, the Sunday night game. And just before we go, let's do a quick look at the CoolBet odds for the Canadian Football League this week. By the way, if you haven't played at CoolBet before, you can use the promo code WST when you make your first deposit for a 100% bonus up to $200 on that first deposit. And every single week, you'll be able to select one CFL bet for a 20% win bonus. And while we're at it, if you are playing at CoolBet and you're in the Winnipeg area, send us a screen cap of your bet slip for your CFL bet and email it to contest@winnipegsportstalk.com for a chance to win a trip to the Labor Day Classic with yours truly. The games right now, Montreal 7-point favorites as it stands Wednesday afternoon against the Toronto Argonauts in the Thursday game. Bombers are now up to 5-point favorites against the Calgary Stampeders on Friday. The BC Lions, this game opened at 6 or 6.5. BC's now 7.5-point favorites. So I think a lot of people feeling like what you were saying, Jeff, that this is a big week for BC and maybe a bit of a reckoning for the Riders. And the Elks right now, 3.5-point favorites for Sunday against the Ottawa Redblacks. And just while we're at it over at CoolBet, let's pull up here's your up-to-date Grey Cup odds. Montreal is the favorite at plus 225. BC is plus 285. The Riders are 5-1. Winnipeg and Toronto at plus 650. Then Ottawa 15-1, Calgary 17, the Elks 45, and the Hamilton Tiger Cats at 50-1. So listen, a great slate of games this weekend. Again, I am looking at some of these lines and some of these matchups, thinking about making our picks tomorrow. And I'm not sure we're going to have a bunch of thrilling walk-offs like we've had the last couple of weeks in the Canadian Football League. There's some powerful teams at home looking to make statements. And that being said, though, we're here for all of it. And Thursday through Sunday, I can't wait.
Yeah, I mean, this is honestly, the odds might look juicy. This is the CFL, man. It's so difficult to predict. It's so, even if you look at Winnipeg and Calgary, you think Dave Dickinson isn't spending the night at the shop probably 3 times this week. His team, he cannot drop another game. It hasn't been great times for the Calgary Stampeders, so they're going to be desperate, and they always play, for the most part, usually at McMahon Stadium, mind you, close games. But, it's just so hard to predict. I don't love giving gambling advice, but if I did, I would say bet live. Live betting is where it's at in the CFL. It's impossible, it feels like, to predict because you don't know what, and I say this genuinely, you don't know what attitude each game's going to take on. And there's so much potential for things to turn on a dime. It's just it's literally like picking spread to me is like flipping a coin in the CFL. It's impossible. It gets tougher as the season goes on, and it's usually near the end where maybe some of the odds makers are asleep at the wheel and not really knowing who's sitting who at the end. But throughout the season, I don't know. I got to give them credit because they seem to have when it looks so obvious that a team's going to cover or a team's going to beat the spread, it seems to rarely happen. So good luck out there for all those people who put their money on the line.
Yeah, no, there's no doubt about it. It ain't easy, and the bookmakers continue to amaze me with just how well they set these lines. All right, well, enjoy the games this weekend, folks. Beginning on Thursday in Montreal with the Argos and Alouettes in an East Final rematch, all the way through to Edmonton looking for their first win on Sunday against the Ottawa Redblacks. Again, a big thanks to Garage Living Winnipeg for their sponsorship and support of CFL 110. For more information on what Garage Living Winnipeg can do for you, your home, and your garage, give Pat Canoe a call at 204-999-1234. Hammer, have a great one, and we'll talk to you next week on CFL 110. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, my friend.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.